A battered German shepherd, blood staining the pristine snow beneath his paws, stands motionless in the middle of a mountain road during a raging blizzard. Most drivers would swerve around him. Most would keep driving. But when Officer Tim Grant hits his brakes and steps into that frozen hell, he has no idea that this wounded warrior is about to lead him on a journey that will uncover a conspiracy, save a life, and prove that sometimes the most profound acts of courage come from those who cannot speak. What this dog reveals will shatter everything Tim thought he knew about loyalty, betrayal, and the unbreakable bonds that transcend species. This is a story that will restore your faith in the power of love, the strength of determination, and the miraculous ways that God works through the most unexpected messengers. The mountains of Kalispell, Montana, held their breath that October evening. The first snowstorm of the season had arrived without warning, transforming the winding roads into treacherous ribbons of ice and uncertainty. Snow fell in thick, wet curtains, each flake catching the dying light like fragments of broken glass. Officer Tim Grant gripped the steering wheel of his patrol SUV, his knuckles white against the black leather. At 28, Tim carried himself with the disciplined posture of a man forged by fire. 4 years as a Marine had carved his body into lean muscle and unwavering resolve. 2 years in narcotics had hardened what remained of his innocence. His steel gray eyes held depths that most people mistook for coldness, but it wasn't detachment that lived there. It was exhaustion that never slept. 3 weeks ago, Tim had arrived in Kalispell under circumstances that followed him like shadows. Melanie Cannon hadn't just been his partner. She'd been his anchor in a world that seemed determined to drown him in darkness. But that night at Pier 15, everything had shattered like ice under pressure. Melanie had insisted on planting surveillance equipment herself, her instincts screaming that something wasn't right. "Don't trust the comms," she'd whispered to him after their final briefing. "And don't trust Jackson." Tim had dismissed her concerns then, but now her words echoed in his mind like a prophecy he'd been too blind to see. The snow fell heavier now, reducing visibility to mere yards. That's when he saw it, a dark silhouette standing perfectly still in the center of the road, unmoved by the howling wind and driving snow. Tim's foot found the brake pedal, and the SUV slid to a gentle stop. Through the swirling curtain of snow, he could make out the unmistakable form of a large German shepherd. The dog stood with military precision, his powerful frame silhouetted against the storm. But something was wrong. The animal's coat was matted and soaked. Dark stains, blood, marked his side like battle scars. One hind leg was drawn up, trembling with pain. What struck Tim most profoundly was the dog's eyes. Even through the storm, those amber orbs burned with an intelligence that transcended mere animal instinct. They were the eyes of a warrior, a guardian, a soul carrying a burden too heavy for words. The shepherd didn't cower from the approaching vehicle. He simply stood there, watching, waiting, as if he'd been expecting Tim all along. Tim opened the door and stepped into the storm. The cold hit him like a physical blow, wind-driven snow stinging his face and seeping through his uniform. "Hey there, buddy," Tim called softly, his voice nearly swallowed by the wind. "You're hurt. Let me help you." The dog's ears twitched at the sound of Tim's voice, but he didn't move. Then, without warning, the shepherd turned and began limping toward the tree line. After just a few steps, he paused and looked back over his shoulder, his meaning unmistakable. "Follow me." Tim stood frozen in the storm, his mind racing. This wasn't random. Every instinct honed by years of military and police training screamed that this dog had a purpose, a mission that had brought him to this exact spot at this exact moment. With a deep breath that misted in the frigid air, Tim Grant made a choice that would change everything. He followed the wounded warrior into the darkness. The forest embraced them with ancient silence. The shepherd moved with purpose despite his injury, weaving between towering pines with the confidence of one who knew these woods intimately. Tim followed, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. 20 minutes into their journey, they climbed a steep ridge, then descended into a narrow ravine. The shepherd stopped beside a twisted cedar tree and began digging at something half-buried beneath snow and fallen leaves. Tim knelt beside him, brushing away the accumulated debris with growing urgency. His fingers closed around something hard and familiar, black plastic, military-grade equipment. As he cleared away the frost and dirt, his heart nearly stopped. It was a covert operations locator beacon, battered and torn as if ripped away in a struggle. But it was the faded letters carved into the inner casing that made his blood run cold. M. Cannon. Melanie, his partner, his friend, the woman who had vanished into the night 6 months ago, leaving behind only questions and grief. Tim's hands trembled as he turned the beacon over, examining every scratch and dent. This was one of the off-grid units, issued only for the most sensitive operations, the kind Melanie had requested when she'd grown suspicious about leaks in their division. The shepherd sat beside him, panting lightly, blood still seeping from his wounded leg. But his eyes never left Tim's face, as if he understood the magnitude of what they'd discovered. Tim reached for his radio, but static screamed in his ear. The signal was dead, jammed by the storm or something more sinister. As if summoned by his thoughts, the crack of a rifle split the mountain air. The bullet whined past Tim's head, embedding itself in the cedar tree with a sharp thunk. Tim dove behind a fallen log, drawing his sidearm. But the wounded German shepherd did something that would haunt Tim forever. Instead of seeking cover, the dog positioned himself between Tim and the direction of the gunfire. A second shot rang out, and the shepherd's body jerked as the bullet found its mark. He collapsed into the snow, blood spreading like spilled wine across the pristine white canvas. No. Tim's cry tore through the forest as he crawled toward the fallen animal. The dog's breathing was labored, his amber eyes clouded with pain. But still, he tried to lift his head. Still, he tried to protect the man who had followed him into the darkness. Tim scooped the shepherd into his arms, feeling the warmth of blood soaking through his jacket. Moving through the forest with the wounded animal, Tim found shelter in a shallow cave carved into the mountainside. He laid the shepherd gently on his folded coat, using snow to clean the wound as best he could. "You're going to make it," Tim whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "We both are, and we're gonna find her, aren't we?" The shepherd's tail gave the faintest twitch against the cave floor. Hours passed in that cave, man and dog sharing warmth and silence, while the storm raged outside. As dawn approached, Tim heard something that made his heart race. A voice, faint and desperate, carried on the wind. It was calling for help, and something in the cadence sounded achingly familiar. The shepherd heard it too. Despite his injuries, the dog struggled to his feet. His message was clear. "We're not finished yet." Together, they emerged from the cave into a world transformed by the storm. Following the sound of the voice, they made their way deeper into the forest. The shepherd limping but determined, Tim supporting him when the terrain became too difficult. They found her in a hidden bunker, camouflaged and forgotten, its entrance concealed beneath years of accumulated debris. The voice was stronger now, definitely female, definitely desperate. Tim's hands shook as he cleared away the camouflage, revealing a steel grate that had been locked from the outside. "Melanie?" he called softly, afraid to hope. "Tim?" The response was weak, disbelieving, but unmistakably hers. "Tim, is that you?" What followed was a reunion that transcended words. Melanie Cannon, thinner than he remembered, her face hollow with months of captivity, but alive, gloriously, impossibly alive. She collapsed into his arms, and for a moment, the world consisted of nothing but gratitude and the impossible reality of second chances. But their reunion was interrupted by a familiar whimper. The shepherd, Bear, for that was his name, Melanie told him through tears, had collapsed again, his strength finally failing. Melanie crawled to her partner's side, her hands gentle on his wounded head. "He never left," she whispered. "All these months, he never stopped looking for help. He knew you'd come. Somehow, he knew." The rescue that followed was a blur of helicopters and medical teams, of questions and statements, and the slow, methodical process of justice. The conspiracy that Melanie had uncovered, a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of their organization, began to unravel like a poorly woven tapestry. But for Tim, the real miracle wasn't the arrests or the headlines. It was watching Bear recover in the veterinary clinic, his wounds healing, his spirit unbroken. It was seeing Melanie smile again, seeing her find peace in the knowledge that her sacrifice had not been in vain. Months later, when the trials were over and the guilty had been sentenced, Tim found himself back in Kalispell. But this time, he wasn't running from his past. He was building a future, the Big Bear Sanctuary, they called it, a place where wounded animals and wounded souls could find healing together. Bear, now fully recovered, had become something of a legend in the small mountain town. Children would gather around him, drawn by his gentle nature and the quiet wisdom in his amber eyes. One evening, as Tim sat on the porch of the sanctuary, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Melanie joined him. Bear lay between them, his head resting on Tim's boot, his breathing deep and peaceful. "Do you ever wonder," Melanie asked quietly, "what would have happened if he hadn't found you that night?" Tim considered the question, his fingers absently stroking Bear's ears. "I think he would have kept trying," he said finally. "That's who he is. That's who they all are. They never give up on us, even when we've given up on ourselves." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Bear lifted his head and looked out across the mountains, his ears alert, his body relaxed but ready. He was no longer the wounded warrior who had stood in that snowy road, desperate and bleeding. He was something more, a guardian, a teacher, a living reminder that hope can survive even the darkest nights. And in the quiet of that mountain evening, Tim Grant understood that some stories don't end. They transform. They become legends whispered around campfires, lessons passed from one generation to the next. Proof that in a world that often seems broken beyond repair, love still finds a way. The wounded German shepherd who had stopped a police car in a snowstorm had done more than save 2 lives. He had restored faith, rebuilt trust, and reminded everyone who heard his story that sometimes the most profound acts of heroism come not from those who speak the loudest, but from those who love the deepest. In the end, Bear had done what all great heroes do. He had shown them that no one has to face the darkness alone, that courage is contagious, and that sometimes, just sometimes, miracles really do come on 4 legs with a wagging tail and a heart full of unwavering devotion. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that hope can survive even the darkest storms, then share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe for more stories that celebrate the unbreakable bonds between humans and the animals who choose to love us. And remember, in a world that often feels cold and uncertain, there are still heroes walking among us. Some wear badges, some wear uniforms, and some wear fur coats and carry their courage in hearts too big for their bodies. May the heavens bless you wherever you are in your journey, and may you never forget that you are never truly alone. Blessed be ye.